Before we turn the first page of this story, let us pause before this photograph. At first glance, it appears to show nothing more than a mountain path, yet this ordinary road once connected two worlds. Long before modern borders divided China and Myanmar, these mountain routes carried merchants, craftsmen, and travelers between Yunnan and the Burmese kingdoms. Along this path traveled more than tea, silk, and precious goods. Languages met here, cultures met here, and eventually communities were formed here. The road alone does not tell the whole story. Roads are only brought to life by the people who walk upon them. For generations, traders from Yunnan looked southward toward the lands beyond the mountains. Their journeys were difficult and uncertain. A caravan could spend weeks crossing steep passes, dense forests, and remote valleys before reaching the markets of Upper Burma. Among these travelers were merchants carrying tea, salt, textiles, and everyday necessities. Some traveled only temporarily, returning home after completing their trade. Others discovered opportunities beyond the mountains and chose to settle in Burmese towns, becoming the ancestors of communities that would grow over generations. Markets were where these worlds first encountered each other. Here, a trader from Yunnan might hear Burmese spoken for the first time. A local villager might encounter Chinese goods, customs, and writing. Slowly, through thousands of ordinary interactions, a relationship would develop between communities that live on opposite sides of the mountains. The history of the Chinese in Myanmar did not begin with a single arrival or a single migration. It began through countless journeys, countless conversations, and countless exchanges that took place along these ancient roads. If the mountain paths were the arteries of this ancient trade network, then towns like Bomo were its beating hearts. Located on the banks of the Irrawaddy River, Bomo occupied a unique position. It stood at the meeting point between the overland routes of Yunnan and the great river system of Burma. For centuries, travelers passed through this town. Chinese merchants brought goods from the north. Burmese traders carried products from the south. Shan communities connected the highlands and lowlands. Bomo was not simply a place of trade, it was a place where different worlds met. Not everyone who crossed these mountains returned home. Some merchants discovered that the towns of Upper Burma offered new opportunities. They opened shops, established trading relationships, and brought their families southward. Over time, temporary journeys became permanent settlements. These early Chinese residents were not simply outsiders passing through. They became part of the communities around them. Their children were born in Burma. Their businesses became familiar landmarks. Their languages, customs, and traditions became woven into the social fabric of the towns where they lived. Communities are not built in a single moment. They grow quietly through families, friendships, businesses, and shared memories. Along the roads from Yunnan to Burma began as journeys of trade slowly became journeys of belonging. The people who crossed these mountains carried memories of their ancestral homeland. Yet in the valleys and towns of Myanmar, they began creating new memories of their own. This was the beginning of the Chinese presence in Myanmar, not a single arrival, but a gradual unfolding of human connections across a frontier. The road from Yunnan had brought Chinese merchants into Burma. It also brought them into the presence of Burmese kings. Long before European colonial rule reached the region, successive Burmese kingdoms recognized the value of commerce with their northern neighbors. Chinese traders supplied silk, tea, metalwork, horses, and other goods that were difficult to obtain locally, while Burma exported jade, precious stones, timber, cotton, and forest products. Trade was never merely an exchange of goods, it was also an exchange of knowledge, ideas, and trust. It is easy to imagine history unfolding only inside royal palaces. Yet the true meeting place between Chinese and Burmese society was often a street like this. Here, merchants opened their doors each morning. Customers came not because of politics, but because trade had become part of everyday life. Languages mingled naturally. A trader might bargain in Burmese, speak Yunnanese with a business partner, and rely on Shan interpreters when traveling through the frontier. The marketplace became one of the earliest classrooms of cultural exchange. We do not know this merchant's name, but we know men like him helped shape the commercial life of Upper Burma. Day after day, they weighed jade, recorded accounts, welcomed customers, and built relationships that lasted far longer than any single business transaction. History often remembers kings. Communities are built by people like this. Not every chapter of history is defined by conflict. More often, it is shaped by quiet gestures of mutual respect. Chinese settlers adapted to the customs of the kingdoms in which they lived. Burmese society, in turn, found room for newcomers who contributed through trade, craftsmanship, and enterprise. Relationships such as these cannot be measured by treaties or royal decrees. They were built one conversation, one act of trust, and one shared cup of tea at a time. By the middle of the 18th century, something changed. The road that carried generations of merchants had fallen unusually quiet. Relations between the Qing Empire under the Qianlong Emperor and Burma's Kongbuang Kingdom had become increasingly strained. What had long been a frontier of trade now risked becoming a frontier of war. Wars are remembered through battles, yet they are experienced through waiting. Merchants delayed their journeys. Villagers wondered whether trade would resume. Families who depended upon the caravan routes faced an uncertain future. For ordinary people living along the frontier, the conflict was measured not by military victories, but by empty roads and silent marketplaces. Between 1765 and 1769, 4 major Qing expeditions entered Burma. The campaigns were costly for both sides. The mountains that had guided caravans for centuries now challenged armies instead. Disease, difficult terrain, and stretched supply lines proved as formidable as the opposing forces. Neither empire achieved the decisive victory it had sought. The remarkable thing about roads is that they remember. Empires rise and fall, wars begin and end, yet once peace returned, the caravans came back. Trade resumed, friendships were renewed, families continued to cross the mountains in search of opportunities. The Sino-Burmese War changed the relationship between two kingdoms. It did not end the centuries-old connection between the people who live on either side of the frontier. In time, that connection will become even stronger. At first light, the mountains stirred to life. Before a single mule took its first step, every bundle was checked, every strap tightened, every animal carefully prepared for the journey ahead. For generations, these caravans connected the markets of Yunnan with the towns of Upper Burma. Their routes crossed some of the most challenging terrain in Asia, yet the men who traveled them knew every river crossing, every mountain pass, and every resting place along the way. This was not an occasional expedition, it was a way of life. The journey was measured not in miles, but in nights like this. Around countless campfires, experienced caravan leaders passed their knowledge to younger companions. Which rivers flooded after heavy rain? Which villages welcomed travelers? Which mountain paths remained safe during the challenging seasons? Long before written guidebooks, this knowledge traveled from one generation to the next. Roads connected places, inns connected people. Here, merchants exchanged far more than goods. News traveled with the caravans, so did rumors, prices, weather, political developments, and stories from distant towns. Every evening, the frontier became a place of languages and cultures. Here's a tea weigher. Look at his hands. Years of lifting tea, tying ropes, counting coins and recording transactions have left their mark. We know almost nothing about this merchant. Yet his life reminds us that great trading networks are sustained not only by ambition, but by ordinary people performing ordinary work with extraordinary dedication. Every journey eventually reached the Irrawaddy. From here, goods that had crossed mountains continued their journey by river to the great towns and royal capitals of Burma. Tea from Yunnan, jade from the northern hills, silk, cotton, lacquerware, timber, and countless everyday necessities. Together, they form one of Southeast Asia's great trading networks. But perhaps the caravans carried something even more valuable. They carried trust. Trust built over generations, trust that transformed strangers into neighbors, and trust that laid the foundation of the Chinese communities that would continue to flourish in Myanmar for centuries to come. Now let's step into a different Burma. The mountain roads still carried caravans, but by the late 19th century, another route had become increasingly important. Steamship now crossed the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea, bringing new arrivals to the rapidly growing port of Rangoon. The Chinese community in Myanmar was no longer shaped only by overland journeys from Yunnan. Increasingly, it was also shaped by the sea. Rangoon became one of Southeast Asia's most diverse cities. Burmese, Chinese, Indians, Europeans, Armenians, and many other communities live and work side by side. Chinese merchants established businesses throughout the city. Some specialized in traditional medicines, others traded in textiles, groceries, timber, or imported goods arriving from across Asia. Once again, commerce became the bridge through which communities came to know one another. Wherever Chinese communities settled, they brought with them more than commerce. They built institutions. Clan associations helped newcomers find work, offered assistance during difficult times, and preserved ties with ancestral villagers back in China. These organizations also became places where traditions were passed from one generation to the next. They reminded immigrants that although they now live in Burma, they had not forgotten where their families had come from. Communities endured because each generation teaches the next. In classrooms like this, children learned to read and write Chinese. They also grew up speaking Burmese, making friends across communities, and adapting to the country they called home. Many would spend their lives balancing two inheritances. One received from their ancestors, the other shaped by Burma itself. There is nothing extraordinary about this street, and perhaps that is precisely why it deserves to be mentioned. History is not only written in government offices or royal palaces, it is written in neighborhoods like this, in conversations shared over tea, in children returning home from school, in shopkeepers greeting familiar customers. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Chinese were no longer simply visitors to Myanmar. They had become part of the country's urban landscape, contributing to its economy, its culture, and the everyday rhythm of its cities. Before we say anything else, take a moment to look at their faces. We do not know their names. We do not know what dreams they carried or what challenges they faced. But we do know this. Families like theirs became the foundation of the Chinese community in Myanmar. Every morning began much the same way. Wooden shutters opened, goods were carefully arranged, neighbors exchanged greetings, customers came and went throughout the day. It may seem ordinary, yet it is through ordinary mornings like these that communities quietly take root. Festivals reminded people where they came from, but they also reflected where they now belonged. The Lunar New Year, Mid-Autumn Festival, and other traditional celebrations continued to be observed. Yet over time, they became part of the rhythm of life in Burma as well. Customs traveled across the mountains. Friendships grew where those customs were shared. Childhood has a remarkable way of ignoring boundaries. The children who studied here often spoke more than one language. They celebrated different festivals. They grew up with more than one cultural tradition. For them, identity was not always a choice between one heritage and another. Often, it was simply both. History rarely enters homes like this. Yet homes like these quietly shape history. Around tables such as this, children learn family stories. Grandparents spoke of villages in China they had left many years before. Parents spoke of opportunities and responsibilities in Burma. The next generation inherited both memories. One looked north across the mountains, the other looked toward the future they would build where they had stood. If we could gather every photograph from this chapter into a single album, we would not find famous generals, or wealthy industrialists, or celebrated politicians. We would find families, shopkeepers, teachers, craftsmen, children. They may never have imagined that one day their descendants would wonder how the Chinese community in Myanmar first found its place. Yet the answer is here, not in one extraordinary event, but in thousands of ordinary lives lived with quiet perseverance and hope. There are moments when history announces itself with great fanfare, and there are moments when it arrives almost unnoticed. An empty classroom, a market that opens late, a journey postponed. During the turbulent decades of the 20th century, communities across Myanmar found their ordinary lives increasingly disrupted by events far beyond their control. Wars are often remembered through military campaigns. Families remember them differently. They remember the homes they left, the neighbors they said goodbye to, the uncertainty of not knowing when or whether they would return. Chinese families, like countless others across Burma, face decisions that no one ever wished to make. Yet, one of history's quietest miracles is the determination to begin again. Markets reopened, schools welcomed students once more, families rebuilt businesses that had taken generations to establish. The rhythm of everyday life slowly returned, not because the past had been forgotten, but because people chose to keep moving forward. In 1948, Burma became an independent nation. For the Chinese community, independence marked the beginning of a new chapter. Many families had already lived in Burma for generations. Their hopes were much the same as those of their neighbors: stability, opportunity, a peaceful future for their children. Like every community, they now look ahead with cautious optimism. If you had met this family in the early 1950s, you may have thought the hardest years were now behind them. The children stood straight looking at the camera. Businesses had reopened. communities were rebuilding, the album continued. Yet history had one more difficult chapter waiting to be written. Sometimes, a single photograph is enough. During the 1960s, Myanmar entered a period of profound political and economic change. Many private businesses, including those owned by Chinese families, were nationalized. For some, generations of patient work disappeared almost overnight. The loss was not only economic, it was deeply personal. Schools are more than places of learning. They are places where memory is passed from one generation to the next. As Chinese language education became increasingly restricted, many families worried about something that could not be measured in financial terms. Would their children still be able to read the letters written by their grandparents? Would they still understand the stories that had traveled from China so many generations before? For many families, the journey began once again. Only this time, the road led away from Myanmar. Some settled in neighboring Southeast Asian countries. Others traveled much further, carrying little more than family photographs, memories, and hope. Their destinations changed. Their story did not. Yet, not everyone left. Many Chinese families chose to remain. They adapted. They persevered. Community life became quieter. Traditions were preserved with care. Even when circumstances changed, memory endured. Perhaps this is the photograph our entire journey has been leading towards. An old man, a family album, a lifetime of memories. Some of the people in these photographs remain in Myanmar. Others built new lives in distant countries. Yet whenever this album was opened, the journey began again. The mountains, the caravans, the markets, the schools, the family shop, they were all still there, preserved one page at a time. Before we turn the final pages of this album, let us return to where our journey began. The road, the mountains are still here. The valleys are still here. The journey is still here. Only the travelers have changed. Where once mule caravans carried tea and silk, trucks now carry modern goods. Where once merchants rested beside mountain fires, families now travel by road built for a new century. Yet the connection between China and Myanmar remains. The story of the Chinese in Myanmar did not end with migration. It continued in homes like this. Some families had lived in Myanmar for many generations. Others arrived more recently. Some maintained strong connections with China. Others felt that Myanmar was the only homeland they had ever known. Identity, like history itself, was never simple. It was layered. It was inherited. It was lived. For centuries, one thread has remained constant: the shop, the marketplace, the exchange between neighbors. From the mountain trading posts of the past to the streets of modern Myanmar, commerce continued to create connections between communities. A shop was never merely a place where goods were sold. It was where relationships were built, where stories were exchanged, where generations grew up. Every generation faces the same question: what should we preserve? What should we change? The young people in this photograph from the 1990s inherited many worlds: the language of their ancestors, the culture of Myanmar, the possibility of the new age. Their future would not be a return to the past. It would be a continuation of the journey. Perhaps this is the photograph that brings everything together. An old man, a photograph, a memory, He belongs to the same story as the caravan merchants we met at the beginning, the same story as the shopkeepers of colonial Rangoon, the same story as the families who rebuilt their lives after war, the same story as those who departed and those who stayed. Every generation receives an album. Every generation adds another page. History does not stop when a documentary ends. Today, Chinese communities continue to live throughout Myanmar. Their story has become part of the story of the nation itself. During the difficult decades of the 20th century, Chinese language education faced severe restrictions. Today, the situation is very different. Private Chinese schools, community schools, and language centers once again teach Mandarin to children and adults across Myanmar. For many families, learning Chinese is not only about preserving their heritage, it is also about connecting with opportunities in today's Asia. Along Myanmar's northern frontier, centuries-old connections with Yunnan continue. Trade, education, tourism, and family ties ensure that the ancient road we followed has never truly disappeared. Festivals continue, temples remain active, community associations still bring people together. Traditions have changed with the times, but they have not disappeared. When we begin this journey, we open an old album. We met caravan traders crossing mountain passes, shopkeepers opening their businesses, teachers, students, parents and grandparents. Some remain in Myanmar. Some made new homes in distant lands. Yet all of them became part of one remarkable story. The story of the Chinese in Myanmar is not simply the story of a people who migrated. It is the story of a people who adapted, who endured, who contributed, and who, generation after generation, continued adding new pages to the family album. Thank you for joining me on this pictorial journey through the history of the Chinese in Myanmar.